Okay, I'm Karen Hladek. I'm a member of the Graduate School Alumni Association Council, PhD in Business Economics, 84. So, yes, other business economics people here. And it is my great honor to introduce Tracy K. Smith. And I have a whole lot of things to tell you about her, which are incredibly impressive. But we're very, very lucky to have you here today. It's just so inspiring. And we were just talking earlier, and there's definitely room for poetry in this world. So we're really looking forward to what you have to say. But I have to get through some housekeeping, all of your great titles and accolades here. You're the Susan S. and Kenneth L. Wallach Professor of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, Boylston Professor of Rhetoric and Oratory, and Professor of African and African American Studies, Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences. You're also a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. Okay. Memoirist, translator, librettist, and you served as the 22nd Poet Laureate of the United States from 2017 to 2019. Tracy is the author of 5 poetry collections, including Life on Mars, fabulous. If you haven't seen it, it's wonderful. And that one, the Pulitzer Prize, as well as Wade in the Water and Such Color, New and Selected Poems, recipient of the New England Book Award. Her memoir, Ordinary Light, was a finalist for the National Book Award, and Tracy's recent work, To Free the Captives, was named the best book of the year by Time and the Washington Post. Her latest book, Fearless Poetry in Perilous Times, continues her exploration of poetry's role in public life. So please join me in welcoming Tracy for her presentation, Poetry in Perilous Times.
Thank you, Karen. Oh, I don't need that, I think. Okay. I'll try and keep that ringing from happening. Is the mic level a little bit too loud? No? Okay. I'm delighted to be here and grateful that you've chosen to spend some time with poems and poetry this afternoon. Oh, great. Okay. I thought I would share some of the thinking and some of the writing in Fearless, which is a book that emerges from my experience as poet laureate, and also from my experience in America during a really fraught era. I was asked to step into the laureateship in 2017. We were 1 year into the first Trump administration. And I had been thinking a great deal during the 2016 election about the shifts in our national vocabulary, the forms of incivility, which is such an understatement, that had become normalized. And throughout that time, I found myself thinking, poetry would not let us behave this way with one another. And this is what's behind that thought. As opposed to the forms of authority that we're encouraged to claim in our day-to-day life, I think it's bolstered by our relationship to technology. It's amplified by the patterns that we have gotten so comfortable with that say, rate this, service, this product, this person, and double down on your opinions in a really authoritative way. Poetry offers us a different approach to language. It, above anything else, I believe, is an art form that insists upon listening as a primary act, listening as an act of devotion that actually should be part of our everyday interaction with the world around us, the natural world, the world of objects, but mostly the world of other humans. Because what is a poem? A poem is another human voice on a page that's seeking to reach you across all manner of distance, space, time, even the distance between life and death in many ways, and to entreat you to a kind of encounter. And as readers of poems, we often find ourselves listening beyond the ordinary level to which we might, seek to hear something. We're leaning toward a peculiar, sometimes vocabulary. We're drawing upon our own memories, recollections, and questions, and lending them to the encounter of the poem as a way of corroborating on some level this other person's experience of the world. Ultimately, what poems give us, yes, they illuminate another perspective for us in many cases, other forms of observation, forms of attention that we don't always make space and time for. But I think even beyond that, they activate an awareness of quiet yet urgent parts of ourselves, the inner life, the questions that don't always make their way into language or even into our conscious awareness, but that nevertheless have bearing upon our lives. And thinking about that, thinking about all of those things, thinking about the technology of the poem, I was excited to step into the laureateship because I felt like inviting Americans from other walks of life, other parts of the country, other value systems to sit down together and to do that kind of listening, to open ourselves up to a viewpoint that's necessarily different from our own, felt like a really necessary civic practice. I think if you read literature in that way enough, when you look up from the page, the people that you encounter are not inconveniences, not obstacles to getting where you want or getting what you want, and not opponents necessarily, but resources of some kind. There's a fellow feeling that I think we can learn. So that's a big part of what this book is seeking to make a case for. And I thought what I would do is share a few sections of the book and intersperse them with some of my own work. I have a book of poems coming out in about 11 months called The Forest. It is a book, like much of my work, that is processing the public events that we live with. And I've done that in many different vocabularies over the course of my career. The last discrete volume of poems that I published, which was called Wade in the Water, had a lot of documentary poetry, poems that turned toward founding documents or language from the historical archive and artifacts in an attempt to make sense of what it means to be alive in America in the 21st century, what it means to live and reckon with and maybe even have a duty to history that's complex and painful in many ways. The newer poems are still invested in these questions. They're also invested in the reality of war as a circumstance that we live with and are complicit with in many ways. But it's turning toward another register of the imagination. I would say they're poems that are borrowing from a kind of ecstatic imagination that I would think of the poets like Walt Whitman or Rumi, poets who are invested in the holy within the everyday world, and the lyric imagination, or the something that moves beyond the linear logic that often underscores argument. And poems are great vehicles for argument, but I don't think that's the only capacity that we can trust to in getting our footing in a world that's in the throes of upheaval, wild upheaval. So I'll go back and forth a little bit, and I'll tell you what I would often tell the people that I met in rural communities in the US during my project as Poet Laureate. Which was essentially gathering with strangers in rehab facilities, community centers, libraries, theaters, detention facilities, and offering them a little anthology of poems called American Journal, and saying, I'm going to read a poem out loud. I think we should also maybe hear it in another person's voice so we can get a sense of what they hear, and then we'll just talk. And my questions couldn't be simpler. My question is, what do you notice? What do the poems that are in the air cause you to notice, remember, wonder, wish, and feel. And we can go a long way toward opening up our engagement with the poem as a text, but I think we can also go a long way toward thinking about what it feels like to be alive right now. So I'll ask you the similar question. My decision not to use slides is an attempt to bring us out of the cognitive mode that we live in and that we're often in at Harvard, and to allow another form of our intelligence, a sensory intelligence and experiential intelligence, to preside and to let you relax a little bit. I love being read to. When we are read to, we become many versions of ourselves, so I invite you to indulge that a little bit. But I'll start with some excerpts from the opening of Fearless. The first chapter is called "A Poem is a Tool for Careful Listening." Throughout my reading life, poems have greeted me with what feels like urgent compassion. When I'm lost or afraid, the speakers of poems assure me that my feelings are nothing to hide from or deny. Indeed, that vulnerability, uncertainty, and even desperation are not only signs of life, but tools for moving forward toward courage, hope, and purpose. When I'm confident in my convictions, poems alert me to complexities I've failed or been unwilling to regard. And like the best of friends, somehow, the poems I've loved for years manage to keep evolving, meeting me where I am, and then, how do they do it? Leading me still further along toward what will startle, console, and even change me. I shouldn't be surprised. Our very selves from day to day are the result of where we've been, what we've seen, how we've hurt and healed, and what we are on the threshold even now of discovering. We never cease in our becoming. Neither does this art form, this confidant, this tool designed to remind us how it feels and why it matters to love, to remember, to ache, to fear, to be astonished by what our minds can make and what our spirits can withstand. I wish I could say to everyone who lives with the fear of poetry, you don't always have to understand it. You can let it nudge you, let it cause something to stir. The sounds of words gliding along next to one another, the glimpse of an image, a face, a body taking flight, rain hammering down in the night, the difference between the droplets hitting houses and those landing in trees, a blanket of sound covering everything it sees. What I mean is, I don't always understand the poems I admire. Sometimes a poem operates by a logic that eludes me, the way dreams often do. Sometimes, like a conversation with a wonderful stranger, a poem speaks to me in words I know, while leading me down paths that are startling and unfamiliar. Some poems seem to carry me away from my usual thoughts, my usual self, which can feel like a gift. How often do we feel overwhelmed in the lives we know? How often does the world as we have come to recognize it, the world as we have been taught to see it, fill us with fright? Far from something to fear, I would say that poetry is an art form that allows us to redefine our relationship to fear by stepping in close to the facets of the world that we don't like or don't understand. Often enough, these are the same things. Often enough, it is the illusion of extraordinary distance, blurring out details and shrouding motives in shadow that makes us fearsome to one another. Not always, of course, but often enough. It's not always possible to test out such a theory in life, but poems are built to bridge distances of all kinds, between people and events separated from one another by time, geography, temperament, and belief. A poem can even traverse the distance between the living and the dead. If you're reading these pages because you love poetry, then I would like to convince you that poems, if you allow them to, can help you to love every other thing in the world around you. Imagine that. Imagine what it would mean to allow a poem which can empower you beyond the apprehension of threat, to move you closer to that which you do not love, allowing you to observe, imagine, and feel your way past indifference or suspicion and toward recognition. Let's leave it there for the time being, because recognition is the threshold for a great deal more. And if you've read thus far because poetry is something that you do not as of yet love, something that has made you feel confused or self-conscious or inadequate, then my wish is to convince you that the opposite of love is not hatred or rancor, but fear, and to help clear that impediment from this and perhaps other contexts in your life. I want to do this not for, but with you, because you and I are not alone. We dwell together in a world riddled with reasons for despair, a world brimming too with forms of beauty that fill us with awe, joy, wonder, fear on one hand, and something like love on the other. So that's just a little excerpt. That opening chapter goes on to narrate some of those trips, thank you, that I was talking about, which were so heartening. And I would love, we can talk about it a little bit in the Q&A, to visit regions of rural America and to be moved out of some of my expectations, to be challenged out of the mindset of having expectations about other people and what they want and who they are, and to be like delighted and educated or illuminated by other people's readings of poems that I've loved for a long time, but really other people's willingness to move toward a stranger, to talk about the things that are real and sometimes painful or powerful for them, and to give in a way that I think we're supposed to be giving, but there's so much that distracts us from that. This is the book that I'm finishing now is called The Forest. And there are a lot of trees in the book, plant life as a sovereign and consciousness holding space on the planet. But I'm also thinking about the forest as a metaphor for you and me and all of us, what we make, what we, cause to grow through the roots we put down, through the forms of care and disregard that we allow. And so there's a cycle of poems running through the book that draw upon these questions and the imagery in many cases of trees, plants, the earth. But those poems I thought I would group them together. I have a lot of poems that are in sections, but they refused to cooperate. And they insisted on sort of being planted or scattered throughout the book. And so they run through as an untitled sequence, appearing here and there. So I'm going to read you one of the early examples of this sequence. The children of trees sprout up from dirt, up through pine litter, up past grass. Formed and waiting from before their birth is the seed of an idea, feasting on air, pushing ever down toward the wet heart of the earth. Emissaries of ecstasy, built from stars, the children of trees are heirs of silence, what the owl breaks open with its cries. Innocence, eloquence, the science holding the world within intact. And so may it be for my children, my tall saplings, whose eyes see at once out and in, whose home is kept within the shade and the wind and the history of trees. All history is the history of trees. I see my sons in a cherry grove, luxurious in full bloom, swaying, twirling in wind. My young trees, my once seedling sons, who hear and heed the voice of the blossoms. This beauty is not us, but it rises through us and is a source of joy. Joy floods me for my willing sons, who aimed their perfect souls at the earth and me on it. The children of trees are children, like the children of rabbits, humans, and doves. Their thin brown branches bounce when you approach. They are so eager to be met. They will play a game with your shadow. Laughter escapes through the tips of their leaves. It pains me to remember the summer a young cousin took an axe to the maple sapling my father grew from a seed. He must have stood there for a moment before going to find a weapon. And for that little while, did the tree trust him? Is this why my sons cry easily, and why their tears seem to leap up from their eyes like rain rushing to quench, to heal the earth? Their sister sat cradled in the arms of a young bearberry tree, books and trading cards nestled in its crook. Lithe and straight-backed as a sapling, shoeless and sure-footed, my daughter taught me to stride fearless over the Pachysandra, despite slugs, despite slick moss-covered rocks, gaze fixed on the sunlight dancing on far flickering leaves. My children, my forest, I am afraid to tell you, but must, about the men, once saplings themselves, who have gone off looking for axes. They will be back soon. And oh, my children, they too reject the distinction between children and trees. I'll say a couple things. I teach a class here every few years called the Black Lyric, and it's a brief survey of 20th and 21st century African-American poetry. And each week after we kind of get through some of the theory around what the tradition of African-American poetry is characterized by, they'll encounter an elder poet, somebody who is no longer on earth, but poets like Sterling A. Brown, Langston Hughes, Gwendolyn Brooks, and others, paired with a contemporary voice. And I think in many ways it's a way of encouraging them to think about inheritance and also to think about the ways that new voices are not only calling back toward earlier voices, they're sometimes ministering to a project that wasn't realized or that, in the cases of some writers, bears biases or flaws that can be, rather than like canceled or erased from public discourse, repaired in a way. And maybe I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But one of the voices that we get to in that class is a poet named Etheridge Knight, who is one of the founding voices of the Black arts movement, movement of poets in the late 60s that was really invested in bringing a Black worldview into public circulation, and, you know, working as the artistic wing that we might think of as parallel to the political investments of, you know, Black power or the solidarity among peoples of African descent across the globe. So Knight has this essay, and he talks about learning from Gwendolyn Brooks, receiving letters from Gwendolyn Brooks when he was first becoming a poet while incarcerated. He had fought in the Korean War, came back from a terrible injury with an opioid addiction and was arrested after the war for theft, I think. Just a dramatic story. But while incarcerated, he became a poet. He found the space, as people sometimes do. And in this one essay, he talks about the sounds of words. And he talks about how certain sounds, certain forms of assonance that like privilege O sounds and ah sounds are really useful for transmitting feelings of longing or grief, and how sweeter sounds like E have a form of excitement or something that is characterized by speed and a kind of attention, a high alert, and sometimes delight. He says it's not just that sounds of words do touch base somehow with these innate human feelings, but think about it. When I'm standing before you, reading a poem, my voice and my breath is causing the air between us to travel. And when it reaches your ear, the small bones on the inside of your ear are caused to vibrate. I'm touching you. And I really do think of poetry as a vibratory encounter, which is one reason why going to poetry readings can be so delightful, but also a great argument for reading aloud, even the poems that you're reading from a book. They can have an effect upon your sensory being that underscores or complicates the cognitive process that reading in a language you understand automatically activates or trips off. So I say that because I feel these words, I feel the rhythms, I feel them to be inherited from certain other writers. I hear Whitman a little bit in some of these lines, and the dashes that sustain these gestures. But it's a journey that is transformed in your being, which I think is interesting to talk about. It's how one's own writing can startle and teach a poet. So that poem has a lot of worries in it. There's a sense of an insular us that I'm devoted to, a family, and a larger us where threat is present, that I'm aware of and afraid of. The challenge to myself right now as a citizen and as a poet is to get away from the we, them binary that comes so naturally to us, the us, them, and to remind myself at every turn, and these poems are an opportunity to remind myself that the we I belong to is large, varied, full of contradictions, roiling with forms of mistrust, and it's also all we have. And so I'm trying to train myself out of the vocabulary of a tribal group or a willing we or the people with whom I share values, like superficial values, and to say the work that must be done is on this huge scale. And I'm trying to become less afraid of that. I'll read you two briefer poems that I think engage with that. They're thought experiments, which is what a number of my poems are, and then maybe pause for a moment to see if you have questions or thoughts, and shift gears toward another passage from Fearless. I lived for many years in Princeton, New Jersey, and while I was there, I lived in a mid-century house that had lots of windows and skylights, and this was during the same time that I was beginning to feel the effects of this shifting national vocabulary, a shifting tenor across lines of differing values, that I started to think, what am I going to do when the apocalyptic vision we're all kind of testing out in our minds becomes a reality? What am I going to do in this glass house? Are we going to try and barricade ourselves and put up walls between us and the world? Or are we going to become the kind of people that open doors and move past the kinds of self-interested fear that come really naturally to humans? This is a poem that allows me to kind of mark that conundrum. Glass houses. It was the kind of house I used to say would teach me not to cower from the chaos that felt possible then, albeit remote. The years when threat still seemed to hover in the distance, audible, but just barely, like a parade the next town over. Neighbors grown strange, militias snaking through streets, forbidden flags rising up from decades of defeat. A war in whose name? A war of whose choosing? My picture windows, my skylights and hallway of glass. The question incessant in my mind was, when the plywood and the loose doors barricading the hung ones are breached by the returning Confederacy, will we fight them off or invite them in? Lay our floor with blankets like a battlefield infirmary, ladle thin soup into lips guilty of epithets, wrap their teeming children in our white, clean sheets. And if we do, if we can, will peace consent to preside? Move our sleeping into the crawl space? Still, will we fight them off or let them in? Condemn or embrace them? If so, will we become them? If not, will the war be lost or won? We sold the house to another family, left that town for one closer to a city. But the question keeps pace with us still, righteous and stubborn as our own tall children. Maybe I'll read you a slightly funny poem, but that I think is still in step with this sense of pushing certain people away from ourselves. And then I'll see if you have questions or thoughts, and if this mode works. The first trip I took to Brazil was about 20 years ago. And in preparation, I was doing language study. And in most of the lessons, there was a character named João that the learner was meant to respond to. So on the recordings, João would say, "Can I borrow, some money?" And the listener would say, "No, João, no." Or all of these different things. And it really started to worry me that this, we were being taught to put up walls and barriers and limits. And I was thinking, poor João, what is it about this guy that we need to somehow teach ourselves to worry toward? And I was back in Brazil this past year, and these cassette tapes came back to mind, and this sense of, barriers came back to mind. And Now João is the title of this poem, which simply means no, João. Now, João. I learned all about you from a set of Portuguese language cassettes borrowed from the public library 20 years ago. You were a bad boy, sweet talker, a whisperer of secrets and irresistible lies. Everyone in every lesson told you no. Now, João, I was made to repeat over and again when you pleaded for money, promising to pay me next Monday. And when your motorcycle was in the shop and you needed to borrow my car. Your eyes would have been devilish and deep, long-lashed and quietly laughing all the time. Eyes that follow a person and then, when met, appear bored, bemused. You were a magnet of a man, and I was forewarned, rehearsing the only reply. Now, João, João, now. But now, traipsing your city all these years later, while my own country flirts with strong men and the dangerous boys who look up to them, you refuse to turn up. Oh, João, where is your harried plea for a night on my posada floor as friends and nothing more. I suppose I'm too late, traveling with my teenage daughter. Old enough to know better, I could finally be your mother if, like much else here, João, you've stayed the same. Or was that you in the elevator of my hotel, a busboy with lips like a ripe question and a pale kitchen net hiding your crown of dark curls? Now that I can recognize in you the restless, undefeated soul so like my father once, or my sons soon, did you arrive only to ask nothing, holding parted the door after pushing an empty room service cart into the hall? You called me Senora, dipped your head as I passed. Wait, João, every version of me wants to know, does this world still insist on telling you no? Pause there, because I'm really curious what you're thinking right now. Do you have questions about these poems or some of the thoughts on the art form? Or what expectations do you bring to this art form? Yes.
And we have a microphone here so that
okay.
everyone...
There's a microphone coming.
So I appreciate... Is it on?
I think you just have to get a little close to it if you're...
Oh, okay. I appreciated your initial comments about how poetry can reach us in different ways, sort of depending on what our current situation is. And one of the pieces of the first poem that you read from Perilous, which spoke to me, was that the opposite of love is fear. And I think I can appreciate that on multiple levels. So not just sort of the politics that's grabbing our nation, but also sort of individual people who I can tell are afraid of things.
Yeah.
And they lash out because of that. So.
Yeah. Thanks for circling back to that thought. I think there's a lot of fear that we have been habituated toward, and the defensive reaction to it is something that's also learned. I think if we were able to take our time, we might find another circuitry to respond through. And that's one of the reasons why I think poems can be so useful. I just called one of the last poems I read a thought experiment, which is what a lot of, I think, poems are. They're a way of saying, what if we look at this familiar thing or person differently? Or what if we move towards something unfamiliar without recourse to the normal fight and flight instincts that kick in real time? What can we learn? What can we recognize? And it feels like time is moving faster in the 21st century. And so in that acceleration or in the haste that we've accepted as our normal state, those fight or flight instincts and prevail a little bit more than this other thoughtful willingness to rethink or to move around, which is one really great argument, as I see it, for making space for poetry, but also in many ways for arts and humanities practices, because they're built of the willingness to step out of the normal flow of time into something more spacious, and also to step into a larger, more authoritative and more courageous version of the self. Emily Dickinson wrote, when I say I as a representative of the verse, all the I pronouns that run through her poem, I do not mean me, but a supposed self. And what I and many poets hear in that is, maybe there's a part of me in this, but the occasion of a poem, which is a dramatic act, allows me to step into a wildly different authority, a wildly different form of presence and insistence than day-to-day life allows. And those things, sure, they can teach us how to argue people down, but they can also teach us to move toward wonder and to dwell with a sense that it might get us somewhere in the forms of uncertainty that are everywhere if we allow them to reach us. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much. How do you tell your students to approach poems? So I think about myself, I come across poems a lot in a bunch of publications, but somehow they don't have the resonance in reading that they do in hearing them. Mm-hmm. So do you give people advice on sort of how do I incorporate the reading of poetry, let's say, or poetry into my normal life?
Yeah. I think poems teach us how to read them. I really do. A poem makes a lot of gestures toward you, asks you to notice things and to be guided by them. So one of the first things that a poem offers in most cases is a title. And if we pause there, we can acknowledge that there's a certain kind of expectation that might be activated in us, the reader, and a certain number of questions. And to see what happens in that little bit of space between the title of the poem and what I think of as the world of the poem, or the land, when we land into the body of the poem, what begins to happen to those expectations and those questions? Are they met head on? Are they upended in some way? Is there a surprise? And you can begin, just as with a person, you can begin to get a sense of the character or the personality or the intentions of the poem. I say if the poem is using syntax that feels familiar to conventional thought or speech, then we can also expect that it's going to obey linear logic in some way. But if the poem's not doing that, we have to let go of the desire for linear logic and statement and understand that language, it might be doing something different. And maybe it's seeking, like Etheridge Knight, to act on us in terms of sound and vibration. Maybe it's seeking to bring a bunch of nouns and verbs together from contexts that have an emotional effect, almost like what I think of as like the emotional weather of a poem. So it's making a conflagration of some sort. And what else? There are a lot of patterns of rhythm or meter, even in a free verse poem. But if you listen, they're always disrupted. And that moment of disruption is a dramatic moment in a poem. So what's happening there? It's emphatic in feeling? Is it attached to statement? Is it attached to some other tool that the poem is using? And so as we begin to do that, you gather a form of willingness and authority, right? To say, I know if I don't know how to deal with this now, I will know how to deal with it soon. The other really important point of a poem, of course, is the closure, which I like to think of as the arrival, because it doesn't always mean that something is being resolved or closed off. Sometimes the arrival of a poem is really where we're launched into a question or a possibility that we need to work on off-site or off-stage from the poem. And again, I've lived loving this art form for so long that I think each of those things, they're important in terms of literary terms, literary practice, but they're much, much more essential to think about in terms of human practice. Like when I meet a stranger, what do I do with them? Do I trust the evidence that someone's offering, and what happens when it changes? Is that a betrayal or is it a provocation? And all of these things, I think, make us different kinds of people toward the many others that we come into contact with. I also, in the book, talk a little bit about judgment, because I know a lot of people are eager to say, is it a good poem or a bad poem? And I actually go to some length to say, I don't think that is necessarily the point. I don't think a poem always wants to be liked. I think a poem is an undertaking towards some kind of experience. And some of the experiences that change us are not palatable, but they're useful. I also like the ways that the values that we're so comfortable in and confident in can become invisible to us. And so why not open ourselves up to other values and see what they can offer, even if we ultimately make choices, based on taste. But I do also understand that some poems are more successful than others. And maybe the last thing I'll say is, if we can look at a poem in some of those ways I described and gather a sense of what its wishes and intentions are, its questions and goals, we can sort of determine to what extent it lives up to its own wishes and its expectations. And I think that's a really good way of deciding. In the workshops that I teach here, it's a way of saying, these lines in your poem set a really high bar, but a lot of the rest of the poem doesn't live up to that or doesn't hold it in mind. How can we get back to that other wish? And I think that's a good way of thinking about the poems we read. But I also would say, you read a poem in the New Yorker, you don't have to judge it. You just have to kind of take it in. And what does it do? It's like another person or another voice in the world. Yeah, thanks.
I just wanted to go back to the last poem that you read about Joao.
Uh-huh.
And I loved the way that ended, because you hear about this omnipresent Joao who's always you have to say no to, and you this big figure you imagine. And then at the end you see Joao in this busboy that walks past. So I found that just a very interesting twist, because it says you have to look at people differently too, and you connect with people who you wouldn't necessarily connect with through the course of your life or your business or whatever you were doing in Brazil. But you looked at him and you saw him as a potential Joao. So that spoke to me. Mm. And I also just wanted to say, we heard a lot in the last session about AI and the limits of AI. And it just strikes me that poetry is one of those areas where I think AI would be hard-pressed to really do what you do and what other poets do, if you want to comment on that.
Mm. Yeah, I like authentic intelligence. That's the AI that I'm really invested in. We haven't gotten to the bottom of that yet. And it's not, as I keep saying, it's not grounded only in the cerebral cortex. It has to do with the vastness and uncontainability or unquantifiability of our consciousness, which continues to surprise and astonish us. I think that imagining the possibilities of AI poetry, which many people are doing, I've seen AI poems before, it turns an artwork or the possibility for feeling and awareness that can be created through art making and encountering into content or a product to be made more quickly and efficiently through some algorithmic learning. How can we imitate thousands of years of language in a way that feels like a credible poem? I'm sure if more and more people are interested in playing with AI will get better at poetry. But I don't want to offload the practice of struggle and investment and creation and question asking that is art making and that is writing. I write poems for me. I hope they will reach you and invite you to move through what in many ways is a counterintuitive exploration of life or life experience that might lead to realizations or questions that are similar to or parallel to the ones that I encountered. But I don't think about you when I sit down to write. I think about my worries. I think about the questions that I live with. I think about the sense of obligation that I have to the future. And I want to do something with that. And language is the tool that I use to do that. If there was something that could answer those questions for me, I would still be left with the absence of what it feels like to undertake that kind of process. And I think that's something, thank God, the students in the poetry workshops that I teach and I believe in the lit classes that I teach are really interested in. What it means to develop the kinds of honesty, courage, and discernment to speak back to the world. Yeah. I'll let you, Jen, decide. There are other hands.
We'll move up the...
Thank you. That was wonderful. I'm curious to hear how you think we could bring more poetry into the broader American culture. It just seems like there's other contemporary national cultures out there where poetry is more a part of everyday life. And it's cloaked as rap, it's cloaked as popular music lyrics. I think Taylor Swift has a lot more young women writing poems maybe than they did 10 years ago. But what could be done to bring it more down to the broader practice of people making art versus more of the ivory tower where it tends to sit for those folks who don't read the New Yorker on a regular basis?
Mm-hmm. I think there are a lot of programs that do exist toward that end, and they're bearing fruit. One program that's been around for probably 40 years is Poets in Schools program. Teachers and Writers Collective, I think in the 70s or late 60s, started bringing poets into elementary schools to teach students poetry. And the logic behind that is elementary school students haven't yet alienated themselves from the art form through the kinds of self-consciousness or the pressure that we grow into. They still live in metaphor, and they love illogic and play that is often the heart of poetry. So that's one thing. And I meet a lot more young people who grow up with a practice of writing poems and reading poems, and who have met poets. I hadn't met a poet until I got to Harvard. To know that there's a class of humans moving through the world every day in your midst. That I think it makes that art form seem more real and more useful and inviting. When I was in the laureateship, I started a podcast called The Slowdown, which is a daily public media podcast, which includes a brief meditation that ideally opens up the space for a poem to be read within the space of 5 minutes. And I did that for 2 years, and then other poets have taken on. So that podcast continues. I think that poems are also useful tools for exploring almost every other subject matter. History, oh my God, there's a huge tradition of poets who are exploring history and finding ways of closing in certain kinds of distance, filling in certain forms of silence, and allowing that tendency toward a thought experiment to take place in actual, events and lives from the world that we're still informed or affected by. I think it gives students not only a sense that poetry can help them make sense of things that are real or practical or important, but also that we can live at different proximities to other lives and other times. And in many ways, even a poem that's not about history, is inviting that kind of realization. So those are some things. And I know that there are more, but one of the things that I think would be really exciting to see, and if you read Fearless, you'll hear some of my responses. If we ask different questions, if our wider culture and the outlets that sometimes decide to cover poetry were to ask better questions about it. The number one question that I as a poet get, especially during National Poetry Month, is, does poetry matter? So it's a default to an old question, an old argument, an old skepticism, and every time it's asked, it reinscribes those things. But my answer to that is, well, does courage matter? Does grief matter in a private life, in a collective space? Does our ability to move through loss and fear towards something like hope, is that important? There's a whole list of human capacities that poems help us to claim that are indispensable to human life. And so we can ask questions that allow us to move toward those possibilities as opposed to discount them from the outset.
Hi, yeah, this is fantastic. Thank you very much. I have a question about your experience as poet laureate. And it kind of ties into all this. Can you tell us a little bit about what the experience was like when you went into you chose to go to communities and introduce poetry to people that are not necessarily like this audience? Were you able to break through? Are there some examples? And okay, this is, you may not want to answer the question because you probably put it in the poem would you open your door to the Confederate?
Maybe I can kill two birds with one stone, or harbor two birds with one open hand. With one story, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about the general project. But so every trip on our list took us to different parts of rural America. And the reason I chose rural America is because I, as a poet, am always going to cities and universities. And I thought I want to go to places where the conversation might not always enter in. Not that I don't think poetry is there, not that I don't think there are poets and communities of readers, but artists are not always invited into the spaces like that, or at least I didn't feel that to be the case for myself. I also understood that in 2017, I would also likely be crossing ideological lines. And I really wanted to be in a space with people who held different opinions about the world. One of the first trips that we went to took us to a men's residential rehab facility in Kentucky that was not the kind of place you check yourself into. It was a place where you're mandated by the court to go to 9 months of rehab. And we got to the venue, and the staff from the Library of Congress pulled me aside, one of the staff members, and said, okay, you need to make a judgment call right now, because there's a guy here. And the men who came to the session also didn't have a choice. It was the thing that they were going to do for an hour and a half on that day. And so he said, there's a guy here who has visible white nationalist tattoos on his neck and face. Do you feel safe? And I had to think for a minute. I said, okay, we've come here under the banner of this art form that I really trust. And I'm willing to sit down in this room and see what happens. And I shared poems by other living American poets. One was a poem by a poet named Laura Kosiski, and it was a poem about heartbreak and these lingering feelings and the nearness of something that could be so far away as well. It's an awful way of paraphrasing a great brief poem called Heart/Mind. And we read that poem, and I said, okay, what do you notice? Guess who raised his hand? It was this guy that I was told, I wouldn't have recognized certain of those images, but I was told, be afraid, fear this guy. So he raises his hand, and he said the most beautiful, generous, vulnerable thing about this poem. He said, I know what this poem is about, but I'm gonna tell you, this vocabulary of heartbreak, it really helps me think about what I'm doing here and what my relationship to substance is like a love affair. And I think we all were moved. There were a lot of tears throughout that trip by the honesty and the beautiful humanity that people chose to share. And so I want to believe that I've decided to open the door. And I want to talk about, part of the reason for writing this book is to remind us that we have more to love about each other if we can slow down than to fear. Yeah. I know there were some other hands.
Yes, I want you to comment on what you were saying about children. 75 years ago, when I was in school and they were teaching poetry, it was about meter. It was about rhyming. Nobody talked about using it as a vehicle for expressing feelings. When I look at contemporary poetry, it seems very different to me. And even the lake poets, for example.
Even the lake.
Like the English lake poets. There's rhyming, there's meter, there's, could you speak to that issue, that a very change? When I listen to you, it's almost like you're talking about a different thing. Mm-hmm. And before I let you answer that, I will make a confession. I have used AI to write like a Christmas greeting I send out at Christmas time in my email, for example. It writes poetry like the inside of a Hallmark card. Mm-hmm. But it rhymes, it has meter, it has all those things that when I was in the 4th grade, if a poem didn't have that, it wasn't a good poem. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could speak to that issue.
I love metrical poetry. I love the music and the harmony of rhyme, and it does live in contemporary poetry. And my students are learning versification, and we're talking about it, even in poets that we don't always expect it. I teach a graduate seminar on Lucille Clifton, a 20th and early 21st century African-American poet. Her poems are often very terse. They have a cosmic set of values and questions. And because she doesn't announce that she's invested in these facets of the craft, it's often her subject matter that we dwell upon. But her poems can be highly metrical. Even if it's not regular and consistent, she uses meter to guide us toward different forms of emphasis and attention. And I think that's in many ways what meter helps us to do. It also creates patterns that we internalize. And so it brings the poem into visceral contact with our body systems. That's not the only way to do that, though. So it also, I would say, it is, this is what I say. Poetry uses language, but it's not about language. And I know there are people who would dispute that. A poem uses this vehicle, this system to get beneath surfaces, and language is ultimately, I think, something that sits on the surface of experience. And so to encounter perfect meter and perfect rhyme sometimes is to encounter a poem that's devoid of life force, which is what I think AI is really good at producing. So I would just try and complicate both takes on that, And I don't know, I like writing villanelles, and meter is one of the hallmarks of that. And as is the moment in any poem, whether it's from the Lake Poets or Shakespeare, when that meter is tripped up and there's a substitution that's employed and we feel something different, almost like a little heart murmur, and that leads us towards something. So there are a lot of ways of creating those kinds of effects. And there are a lot of poets who are still writing in formal verse.
Can you talk about your process? How did you write a certain time every day? Do you do it when the mood catches you?
Okay, that's a question about process. I'll just say for the recording. Yeah. When I am on sabbatical, I could write all day. And sometimes it means sitting down to face the questions I'm aware of. But often enough, if I find myself writing one poem, more questions are generated by that. And what I can enter into is an extended meditative, I would say meditative because I meditate, but a state of reflective and attentive state where many poems can come. This manuscript is the result of that kind of a concentrated period of writing. And it's my favorite way to live, to be listening. And I don't know if you've ever taken a photography class, but when you walk around with a camera, suddenly you see photographs everywhere. You see things that tell stories that you could capture. When you're writing poems, you recognize all of these opportunities for poetic seeing and listening. And so for me, that's heaven on earth. But I also am interested in writing when I don't have those long expanses of time. And sometimes a poem, like that João poem, I wrote it in the Sao Paulo airport while I was waiting for my connecting flight because I didn't want to let go of this experience that I had had, that I wanted to look more deeply and vulnerably toward. And sometimes those poems that come in the middle of things can also feel like real gifts. Oftentimes when I'm writing outside of proper time, what I get are kernels of questions or kernels of poems that I will come back to when I have more time. And I think it's different for everyone. I love waking up at like 4:30 in the morning when everything is asleep and to be listening to what feels like a pure thought space, and then to watch what happens when the sun comes up. That's my favorite way. I also love more and more writing outside. And I think that's why there are so many trees in this book, and birds and animals, and the natural world as an agent of purpose, because I wrote a lot of these poems outside. Other questions or thoughts? I feel like I want to do two brief things. I want to read just a couple of little paragraphs that also I hope are kind of an invitation to think about the uses of poetry in a moment of political consternation, whether that means as somebody who's writing, but mostly as people who might become receptive to the capacities poems invite in us. And then maybe I'll end on one last poem, if that's okay. Let's see if Okay, so what I haven't shared are a lot of the close readings that run through this book that allow me to talk about some of the capacities of the art form, and also pull back the curtain for people who are nervous about approaching poetry on how one might go about reading and responding to and thinking with a poem. So this reading emerges after a chapter that has to do with thinking about the forms of harm that we endure, whether they're private, it opens with private grief, or public, like the harms that we might even be involved in. And so it moves from private grief to a poem by Danez Smith, whose speaker realizes that they are accountable for great harm in the life of a classmate, and sort of acknowledges that and hopes to do something with it. And then it moves to a poem that has to do with war, written in the voice of a child, by Naomi Shihab Nye. And so this is a question that comes out of that reading. Is it enough to carve out a place of relative peace and safety in a world roiling with the commotion of occupation and war, political instability and civil unrest, wild disparities in health, wealth, safety, and peace of mind? Is it enough to stay, quote, inside, which is a phrase from the poem, from the noise of the world? Granted, such a decision can be seen as practical, and likewise as reasonable. One might even argue convincingly that for some, avoiding the fray is responsible. But in the larger scheme of this time in which we live, a time of change and volatility we delicately refer to as one of increasing uncertainty, what is the much, that's another word from the poem, needing doing? And by what means ought we to be willing to get it done? These are questions posed mostly to people outside the field of poetry, historians, political analysts, scientists, and the like. But our view of reality dwells in patterns of thought and expectation that reside in language. What we tell ourselves when we're afraid or angry, or when we're shocked into outrage or silence, even then, it is language via thought that operates to assure or embolden. She never listens. He isn't telling the truth. I don't know what to do. It's okay, we'll be safe. Therefore, to create new patterns of language, as poems and poets exist to do, is to alter or correct course on our story of reality, to move from a state of fear to one of understanding, or from the sense that you are small and bound by the circumstances in your life to an acknowledgement that you are large and your purpose eternal. That kind of transformation begins in language, in talking and listening to yourself, to others, to a voice on a page. Language is the engine for our sense of the possible. And poetry fosters a productive impatience with the notion that things as they are cannot or must not be made to change. That's one little theory of the art form. I'll leave you on a poem that comes late in the last poem in the book. And it's also one of these untitled forest poems. Sometimes I dream of a steep hill dotted with trees where but who do I mean by we? Will one day find ourselves sitting, staring out onto evidence of the end. It won't be sad. Nothing will have ended but what had already revealed itself insufficient. Small fires will burn, mounds of ember and ash. I keep trying to touch the name of the feeling that will have settled in our bodies by then, after knowledge and regret, after hope and steadier, more certain because more honest because we will by then have seen our biggest lies, the final and most dire, shatter above us in the common sky, taking away everything with them that needed to go. I see us there on the hill. Who do I mean by us? Some combing fingers through long tufts of grass, others leaning back on our hands or hugging our own bent knees, watching in the same direction, out and down upon the passive distance. All of us? All, I guess? Nothing remaining to battle over, nothing to hide, no rewards for what we've long prized. I see us astonished, finally, and each differently. Some of the forest of us at home in the silence, others talking softly in our original voices. Thank you so much.